We're on a road to nowhere. Come on inside. Taking that ride to nowhere. We'll take that ride. I'm feeling okay this morning. And you know, we're on the road to paradise. Here we go, here we go. There's a city in my mind. Come along and take that ride, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. And it's very far away, but it's growing day by day, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. Would you like to come along, and you can help me sing this song, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. There's a city in my mind. Come along and take that ride, and it's alright, baby, it's alright. And it's very far away, but it's growing day by day. It's alright, baby, it's alright. They could take a
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Let me check these comments. Okay. So to anyone who is joining that is new, I am about 85% blind, so I won't be able to see your comments until I use my, fabulous machine afterwards. However, my incredible guest can feel free to pull comments or questions as we discuss. So tonight, I'm so excited to have Harvey J. Kaye. You are an author. You just retired as a professor. And I love first of all, thank you to my dear friend, Marianne Williamson, for kind of inadvertently hooking us up. But also, I love what she said about you, that even though you retired, school in the conventional idea, you are still teaching people, and that's so important, and that's amazing. So thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And the coincidence was that I'm pretty sure I received your direct message around the same time as I was sitting in the parking lot, I think, waiting at the airport.
Yeah, you are.
To pick up Marianne, to take her back to the hotel before we went to dinner that evening. And then she was going to talk the second night. So it was just funny. And the first thing I said to her was, I got a direct message from a real fan and friend of yours. And I mentioned that to her. She goes, oh, well, you have to do the show. I said, well, I've pretty much agreed to. So.
Yeah, she's the best. She's been like my mentor after she first came on. She's just wonderful. And you, now that you have retired, is that, because you were talking about the disconnect, kind of doing it on Zoom. Is that kind of the main reason?
What happened really is that I never intended to retire. I just figured I really liked being in the classroom. But then I'll never forget, it was in March that we left the classroom, and we then did a sort of home schooling kind of thing for with the students. And the summer came, and I thought, oh God, we're going to have to go back to one of these situations where I'm looking at a screen. And even though I would have been pretty demanding that they turn on their video so I could see who they were, I thought I didn't want to have to go through that every single time. And then the other thing was that this is different. I can have a conversation with you. Even if there were 10 of us, we could have a conversation. But if I was going to have 50 students, and that's a smaller lecture course, if I had 50 students, I just thought, oh man, it's just not going to work the right way. And so in essence, I thought, well, I'll retire. I started thinking maybe I should retire, step out. And then the state was eager. They thought they were going to be losing a lot of money they assumed there'd be a recession because of the pandemic, and that they should probably try to save money. So they offered very senior faculty buyouts. So they offered me half of my upcoming year's salary if I retired. And I thought, wow, I don't want to pass up the money that I could possibly do something with if I'm going to bother to be retired. So I stepped out, and I only miss the students in a classroom. I don't miss grading the students at all. I mean,
Yeah.
to tell you that, I mean, that's the worst part about being a professor, is grading students. And then the other thing is, I really didn't like dealing with deans. Are not pleasant to deal with, okay, especially in the age in which we live, when budgets are tight and everything is sort of an effort to somehow get faculty to do even more than they already do at a very minimal kind of pay. So I thought, I don't really miss it, I guess, as much as I thought it would, because of things like this. So I can reach lots of people. I do a radio show every week on Friday with Jeff Santos out of Boston. I do a Monday night recording with the Casey Morning Show, a daily podcast, and the Tuesdays when our recording broadcast is known as Take Back America, where we've been going through great American words, radical history and radical words from the American story.
It's not a radical idea. Sorry, I had to.
Well, actually, as a sidebar to that, it pisses me off no end that the folks who I know I'm going to end up voting for, the Democrats, obviously I'm not going to vote for anyone but the Democrats at this point in time. But what's so upsetting is that they constantly point to the Republican reactionaries. They call them radicals, and they're not calling them reactionaries, which they should be calling them. It's a tragedy. And then on Thursday night, I do a 1-hour gig every week with David Feldman, who's a Emmy Award-winning comedy writer who does two 5-hour YouTube shows, one Monday and one Thursday. Wow. And Alan Minsky of Progressive Democrats of America, he and I wrap up the final hour with David on Thursday night, which is, I guess it's 10 to 11. I think it's 10 to 11 Eastern time. Yeah, the David Feldman show, because it's at 9 o'clock that's right, it's 9 o'clock my time, so it's 10 o'clock in the East. And then I try to accept nice offers like yours and others. So I guess I do like 4 events at least a week, and I'm hoping I can reach a lot of people with my arguments about history, historical memory, the imperative that we take hold of our history, that especially figures such as Thomas Paine in the American Revolution, whose legacy I still believe is much more powerful than most people appreciate. And Franklin Roosevelt, who, for all of his faults and failings, was, at least in the 20th century, the greatest president, very progressive. In fact, in my mind, a rather radical figure, as was Lincoln in the mid-19th century. So those are the kind of arguments I've been trying to make. And I also spend half of my time lambasting Democrats for having turned their back on the past. And the other half, I don't actually bother to lambaste the Republicans very much, because they're just so vile. I mean, it should be self-evident to thinking people. The better question is, why did the Democrats 45 years ago turn their backs on the working class? Why did they abandon the Franklin Roosevelt tradition, a tradition that was, to a great extent, they're not obviously not completely sustained all the way through the 1960s. And quite often we think of the 60s, we think of it discreetly, when in fact, from the mid-30s through the 60s is really, in some ways, a long age of Roosevelt. Okay, the 60s were, of course, in many ways significantly different than the 30s, in good part because the 30s happened. Thus, the 60s was an effort on the part of Johnson, the Democrats, and my generation, even more in quotes radically, to realize the kinds of promises made in the New Deal that were not necessarily fulfilled because of racial discrimination and Southern segregation, obviously the marginalization of women, and so on and so forth. But anyhow, so I hope to reach as many people as I can and get them. Well, I'll say before it's too late. Tuesday may make it very late. But beyond that, whether we win or lose on Tuesday, that is, liberals and the left and progressives and radicals and socialists, whether we win or lose, the point is that we have got to very quickly go on the offensive, especially those of us on the left. We have got to start championing not just the American radical story, but the American radical legacy, the necessity, in FDR's words, of an economic Bill of Rights for all Americans, those kinds of things. I don't think we can. I mean, we may take a beating on Tuesday, or we may even win. Either way, we haven't really won until we start turning the tide in American politics and make America the radical country that it has been in the past, and we do it anew.
I'm curious if you think that's feasible, because we had Bernie twice, and he was the closest thing in my 43 years for sure. And millions of people, full on revolution, millions of activists, and we got screwed. And so is it feasible? People are very defeatist right now, understandably, and a lot of people feel, and I have my moments as well, that even if whoever wins, we are still not in a good position, because
absolutely, you're right. Yeah. But okay, well, let me give you reason to believe it might be possible, and I'll do it both in terms of what's happened in the past, what happened with Bernie, and also what is the case. So, and I want to start from the fact that Americans are not inherently conservative or reactionary. Undeniably, a good number are. Let's throw out a figure. Let's say 20% we would not want to go have a beer with, right? As simple as that. Okay. Nor would they want to have a beer with the likes of you and me. Having said that, the point is that the vast majority of Americans still do, however anxious they are about it, still do believe that there is something unique. I'll even go so far as to say exceptional about America. The exceptionality doesn't make us better. What it means is that there's an inherent challenge in being an American, okay? That is, we're all heirs to a promise. The promise, regardless of who authored it, there was a promise made in the Revolution of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And whenever I've asked people, students especially, what does it take to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they always put it in terms of a kind of social democratic America, okay? That, a guaranteed job at a living wage with, collective bargaining rights, guaranteed free public higher education as far as your capacities might take you, guaranteed healthcare, universal healthcare for all residents in the United States. I mean, those kinds of things. And in fact, the polls have shown that that's exactly what Americans want. The great majority want healthcare. They want education. They want the jobs that pay a living wage. They want all of those things, and they want those things to be rights. Now, since they want those things, one can ask, why have they failed in all these many decades that they have wanted those things? When FDR called for an economic Bill of Rights, 85% of Americans wanted national health care, universal health care. They wanted education, as free public higher education, as far as their capacities could take them. They wanted the kinds of things that we would call a good life in a good society that America is more than capable of affording. Okay. So what happened? Well, those who oppose such things, okay, capital, or as we used to say, big business, conservatives, and in the course of the last 45 years, neoliberals, they declared war on the democratic achievements of the 1930s through the early 1970s. They just declared war. They sought to crush, and they succeeded in crushing the most energetic elements in the labor movement. They wanted to strip American women of the rights they had secured in the course of the 1960s. They wanted to literally overturn voting rights and perhaps even civil rights, but decidedly overturn the Voting Rights Act. So they declared war. Now, the problem is that the Democrats, it's not that they were already reactionary or even conservative. It's that basically they had given up the fight. They were already, if you like, they were too settled, you might say, in liberalism. They had been winning ever since the war. They took it for granted. They were increasingly reliant on big money donors, not unlike the Republicans. they were increasingly afraid of their own fellow citizens. They were afraid of democracy as much as the Republicans hated democracy. The Democrats were, in essence, afraid of real democracy. That's the case. So what did we see? We saw no major political force during all the years that the rights and the democratic achievements from the 60s through the early 70s were under siege. And we know all these many years later that unions were crushed, okay, that women are constantly threatened to have their rights stripped from them, that they've been very effective in suppressing the vote, the right wingers, okay? Okay, so having said that, well, Bernie showed very clearly that vast numbers of people, especially people under the age of 50, but not only, vast numbers of Americans wanted exactly the kinds of things he was calling for. Now, it's interesting, in 2016, or I should say 2015, going into that election period, Americans were asked what kinds of change they wanted. And there were descriptors available in this survey, this polling that was done. And the vast majority, or at least the great majority, said they wanted, in quotes, radical change. Now, they didn't always specify the changes, but they wanted radical change. There were two figures in 2016 who offered the possibilities of dramatic change. One was Donald Trump, if you like, the reactionary rendition. Though, in fact, his politics were really no different than the vast number of, well, not the vast number, I keep using the word vast, than all the other Republican candidates. In fact, he came across, strangely enough, as the most liberal of the Republican candidates. He wasn't going to overthrow Medicare and Medicaid. He wasn't going to do the kinds of things they were going to do. I vaguely recollect that in the debates, he said he didn't want to see people dying in the streets for lack of health care. Well, the point is that he lied. Okay. We know all the kinds of things he is, the corruption, the lies, the degree to which he probably despises women. The fact that even his own daughter converted to Judaism and married a Jewish man, that he's got these clearly anti-Semitic kinds of views of the world. I mean, his father was a Klansman or a Nazi or a whatever back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, who the hell knows. The point being that Americans wanted change, dramatic change. Bernie offered the radical rendition of that. But even the radical rendition he offered was essentially a new Franklin D. Roosevelt Democratic Party politics, which most Americans do want, okay? But then, of course, the establishment Democrats, the centrist Democrats, for lack of a better word, the corporate Democrats, of course, the Clintonite Democrats, okay, who had already, if you like, turned their backs on the working class and labor. We saw that all the way through the Clinton years. I mean, Jimmy Carter launched neoliberalism. Ronald Reagan grabbed hold of it and made significant changes. But Bill Clinton was the foremost of the neoliberals, if you think about the fact he was a Democrat. Now, Bernie himself, I'm going to be critical of Bernie too. Bernie himself, in essence, he failed himself and us. I know he was the guy who literally created a movement. I know he was the guy who made socialism a viable term again. But having said that, Bernie didn't do what we seriously have needed doing for decades. People, whether they were liberal, radical, socialist, broadly speaking, left, have needed a narrative, a story, a vision of what it means to be a progressive, okay? And while Bernie offered a great argument against billionaires and he offered an agenda of change, he didn't cultivate a narrative. And what I mean by that is, instead of going in and into the primary saying I'm a democratic socialist and then spending inordinate amount of time trying to explain what democratic socialism is, he should have said, I am an FDR Democrat, the greatest president of the 20th century, the most popular president in American history. Okay, the president whose New Deal created Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act, literally transformed the American landscape, Okay, the CCC fought soil erosion, fought, the destruction of the environment, planted like 3 billion trees. Okay, the WPA that built schools, that created roads, helped lay sewer lines. I mean, over and over again. In so many ways, the American landscape was transformed in the 1930s. And it was that generation, of course, that was also the generation that in the 60s, again, for all their faults and failings, elected Johnson with the idea of fulfilling the New Deal by way of a great society. They elected senators who enacted civil rights, voting rights, immigration reform. I mean, you've got incredible legacy there. And so Bernie might well have literally, said, hey, I'm the FDR Democrat in 2015. But instead, he spent his time lambasting billionaires. I love lambasting billionaires. But he also spent his time telling us that we're failing. Look at what Scandinavia does that we haven't done. Well, you're never going to win votes by telling Americans that some foreign countries are doing things that we're not doing. Michael Moore showed how eccentric it was when it was Where to Invade Next was the title of that film of his. And what he showed it, and everyone missed the point. He wasn't saying, look how great the Europeans are. What he was saying was, these were all American ideas that the Europeans took hold of and continued to pursue. On top of that, he could have talked about the American story, the promise of the American Revolution of life. In other words, he didn't take hold of history. And then in 2000, and in essence, Hillary said to him, hey, we're not Denmark or something like that. And she beat him in the primaries. Of course, it was to some extent rigged, but the point was he couldn't crack the South effectively. He couldn't crack the older generation that might well have responded to the FDR kinds of stuff more than to the I'm a democratic socialist, which he had to explain, as I said, over and over again. Then in 2020, once again, he enters, and sadly, his website laid out all the FDR kinds of things, an economic bill of rights, workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera. But when he went into the debates, he did the same thing. He did not say, I'm an FDR. In fact, imagine this. When the likes of Buttigieg or Harris or all those folks, who God forbid they should ever be our candidate in the Democratic, for the Democratic nomination next time around. Okay. The fact is that when they came at him and said, you want to bankrupt America, he should have said, wait a second. You sound like the Republicans in the 1930s who did not want to see the passage of Social Security, who did not want to, right? I mean, he could have literally called FDR into the room. Sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but Eugene Debs,
you're absolutely right.
Eugene Debs in 1918, when he was arrested and charged with sedition because he had challenged the war effort in a very mild-mannered way, when he defended himself in the court, he brought into the courtroom Thomas Paine and Abraham Lincoln, all the original dissenters who were also the great figures of radicalism and progressive in American history, and said he was calling them to stand alongside him. Well, imagine if Bernie had said, I want to bring FDR into the room. What would FDR say if he heard you folks talking like that? Is this the Democratic Party? He could have even made a joke. Not a joke, at least in my mind, it's a joke. He could have said, you all belong to the party. You all say that I'm not a member of the party. Well, I'm the member of the FDR Democratic Party, right? Yep. So anyhow, possibilities. The fact is that you've got to be cultivating a narrative. And the agenda is great, but it should be, if you, not to use the speech professor's terms too much, but it's got to be framed in terms of a narrative and a vision. And, so it frustrated the hell out of me. I tweeted something. I didn't tweet. I sent a message around to a lot of people today. If you don't mind, I'll shut up after I read this message.
No, absolutely. I went, I'm in Pennsylvania, and I moved to Iowa for 5 weeks to volunteer for Bernie in 2020. And I learned a lot of this, like, well, what does that mean? And I'm like, he inadvertently turned socialist into a pejorative. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much what happened.
Not amongst young people, I admit. But the fact is that, people ask me, what am I? I said, yeah, I'm a social democrat. I'm a democratic socialist. Okay. I ask questions of a Marxist sort. A whole series of things I would say. But if I'm running for political office, I would just say I'm an FDR Democrat, which is exactly what Bernie was. So I sent this around, not to bellyache, but here's what I sent around to lots of people. You know, I tried to get people to pay attention to the hijacking of the American past by the new right. But the left, both liberal and left, did little. I warned of how the right was hijacking the founders and even Thomas Paine, the radical. I warned of how Republicans and Democrats alike celebrated FDR and the Greatest Generation for winning World War II, but suppressed the memory of that generation's fights and victories for social and industrial democracy. And I repeatedly have argued for us to take hold of our history and create a united front, liberals, progressives, socialists, and radicals, to defend democracy by extending and deepening it. And what I mean by that is you don't save democracy by defending it. You save democracy by extending, enhancing it, deepening it. This was FDR. FDR knew that. That's why he was president as long as he was, because Americans responded to his vision. So I then close with, can you imagine how I feel to see Gopers, GOP folks, go reactionary, if not fascist, and for the Democrats to put more effort into beating down progressive than into beating Republicans? After 45 years of class war by capital, conservatives, and neoliberals, I then say, forget I told you so. I'm just downright fearful. So, and as you could tell, I'm also angry as hell. So
never ever lose your sense of outrage. Yeah, I mean, I think we all got a rude awakening. And, as someone who went to college 20 years ago or something, 25 years ago, I still remember quite vividly what I learned in high school. And I can tell you, like, Bernie's what radicalized me in 2015. I was very much like, yes, I love Obama. And, just very much Democrats good, Republicans bad. And I started learning about people like Debs and Paine, and and I realized, and I'm in Pennsylvania, we have a Paine statue. I don't even know why but none of us were ever
hold on. To my knowledge, there's no Paine statue in Pennsylvania. There is one across there's two in New Jersey, and a third one is supposed to be
okay.
There's a Paine Square in Philadelphia.
Yes, I've been there. Yeah.
Okay.
That's actually where we protested at Occupy DNC for the convention.
Great. Well, Thomas Paine, when he came to this country, and he came when he was already almost 40 years of age, and he literally, had to leave England because he was, he had been fired from his job a couple of times. And Benjamin Franklin, who was then living in London, he and Paine had a conversation, and Franklin urged him to go to the United States. So Paine came to Philadelphia. He came to Pennsylvania. That was Paine's city, Philadelphia. Later, he ends up, after the American Revolution, he ends up going back to Europe. He's trying to, not for political reasons, he was trying to create an iron bridge in Philadelphia across the Schuylkill River. But there was no bank that could, there were no banks in the United States. So he had to go find money back in Europe to build a big model and get support for the bridge. And when he got back to England, he realized he was a public figure there just by the way in which he had called for the American Revolution. And then he ends up angry at the way, Edmund Burke, the conservative, lambastes the French Revolution. So he writes The Rights of Man, and he becomes the foremost political figure for the people, for the common people in England and in France. And then, of course, I won't go through the whole story, but he comes back to the United States, but he does not come back to settle in Philadelphia. He comes back and settles in New York, in fact. Yeah. And then he dies in New York City.
And he wrote Common Sense, which is...
Right. Cool. Common Sense is the pamphlet. And I urge everyone, by the way, as long as I'll just do a show and tell, okay?
Oh, and I see your new book right there too, as well.
This is the most important of my books, I guess. Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. So this is the story of Thomas Paine's life and labors, and then it retells the story of the United States all the way through to our time by way of Thomas Paine's legacy, because he was his memory. Conservatives of every sort did everything they could to suppress his memory. But in every generation after the revolution, whether they were religious freethinkers or abolitionists or women's rights activists or working men's activists, what you go all the way through American history to labor unionists and progressives and socialists and communists and anarchists and all the way through, their hero is always Thomas Paine. So it's as much as the powers that be are trying to suppress his memory, the common people, working people, are reaching back to the revolution and constantly rediscovering Paine and harnessing his arguments. So revolution is Common Sense and the Crisis Papers. Then in the French Revolution, his famous work is Rights of Man, which American revolutionaries and radicals forever after also made a point of quoting and citing. He also challenged organized religion because he was not an atheist. He was what was called a deist. Okay, he believed in God, the creator, and he believed in a sort of sense of providential history. And he wrote The Age of Reason, which was an attack on the organized churches of that day. He also then later wrote, people know this the least of all, but he wrote a pamphlet entitled Agrarian Justice, which is actually a pamphlet that calls for the creation of what we think of today as Social Security. He is the godfather of Social Security. In fact, if people go to the Social Security website, I believe that in the section of the history of Social Security, it starts off with Thomas Paine's call for what he didn't call it Social Security. He called it, he said, we need to fight poverty before it begins and amongst what we would call the elderly. The point was, he said, after a certain age, people should not have to work and they should be provided with pensions. Young people starting out in life, to prevent them falling into poverty, should be given a grant of money for education, to buy land, or to set up in business. And he said, well, and then he said, the way to pay for this is those who own the land, the big landholders north and south and throughout the world, owe all the rest of us a payment, because God created the earth for everyone to enjoy. And since landowners were literally monopolizing that land, they should pay into a national fund. That fund should then pay out to young people and the elderly to keep them from falling into poverty. Yeah, Thomas Paine, by the way, he was my hero ever since I was 10 years old.
You're so fortunate to learn about these people so young. I mean, I felt like just, it's such a rude awakening when you find out there are other people who you believe the same things, There's one woman, Muriel, what's her last name? I wanted to talk to you about her per your new book. Muriel Saltman. Are you familiar with her?
I don't.
Oh, she's a.
So people know the new book. Oh, the new book is this.
Yes, well, please share.
And this actually was my very first book, published back in 1980, the winter of 1984-85, in England, in Britain, and the United States, and then eventually the rest of the world in translations and stuff. This book then came out in a new edition in the mid-90s, and then a few years ago, this publisher, Zero Books, who had brought out this collection of my speeches and essays, Take Hold of Our History, they said, maybe we could publish a new edition of the British Marxist Historians. And what I added to it is a memoir of the time and experience I had dealing with, working with, interviewing, and writing about the historians. So it's new in the sense that it's a new edition, but I wrote it originally. How old did you say you were? 40 years ago I wrote that book. 40 years ago I wrote that book when I guess I was 30 to 33, something like that.
That's amazing. And how does it feel as, as a professor and as someone who has written these books on, FDR and Paine and everything, to kind of see these terms coming out, and coming back, such as communism, capitalism, socialism, Marxism? Like, is it frustrating you because some people they just don't understand that they're completely wrong about what they are? Or does it excite you that people are?
Okay. I mean, it's both. Well, I mean, I've lived long enough to have seen it happen the same way in some ways. That, look, I mean, communism is a term that is so alien to people in the West because of what happened in the Soviet Union that I would utterly avoid the term myself. I know others would think differently, but no way am I going to go spouting the notions of communism. I mean, my primary concern from the very age of 10 and my embrace of Thomas Paine then was democracy. And to me, what the left needs to be about is small d, capital D, or all full capital letters, DEMOCRACY, democracy. And if you're a socialist, and I think many of us would say we are, the idea is we extend and deepen democracy so as to include what most people think of as the economy of, it's a kind of socialization of democracy, the extension of democracy into areas of life that for too long have remained, well, in the case of work and business, dictatorships.
Right. I mean, I guess, as an activist, I struggle with how do we make that happen when so few people actually hold politicians accountable, and they do I'll vote for them because they have a D next to their name because they're better than XYZ, and they're still not representing the people.
Okay, that's a great question, and I promise you in a moment I'm going to answer it. But I'm just looking at a comment. MNNW said, "Agrarian justice seems like a folk indie band." Damn, that sounds like a great idea. If anybody wants to create a folk indie band, please think of title.
That'd be amazing.
That is amazing. Some years ago when I was working on my first Thomas Paine books, that would have been the early 2000s. Yeah. There was a band, I think, out of Atlanta called Paine's Promise. And I contacted them and I said, "Hey, did you name it after Thomas Paine, or is this somebody in the band?" They said, "Oh, no, Thomas Paine." So I sent them a copy of the book. They sent me a copy of their CD. I'll just see if there's something else. Miguel H. Yes, right. I mean, this is in England the same as this. You don't want to do that, of course. It's
right.
This, right? Okay, and vegan succubus savage. Well, thank you. I hope that was a compliment.
Oh, because they call me Savage Joy.
Okay. Well, that's a compliment to you then. Okay. So Joy, here's the deal. In response, here's the answer to your question. Whenever students used to say to me, "How do I decide who to vote for?" I would say to them, "Okay, I can't tell you who to vote for. That would be literally imposing myself onto your brain. But ask yourself this, couple of things. First of all, allow for the fact that it's not likely you're going to find the candidate who's doing what you really want them to do. So right now you vote defensively. Don't vote in any way that would allow things to get worse. But I can tell you they've gotten worse over 45 years. In the meantime, I always urge people, vote defensively. You may be disappointed. You may be pissed off. They're not doing the kinds of things you want. But think about voting defensively. That's the first part. However, now let me turn to the really important matter, and that is, how the hell do we take back America? And I think the primary vehicle, if people are not, how can I put it this way? If people do not have a labor union, talk to their fellow workers and see if there's any interest in it. By the way, do it quietly, okay?
Yeah.
Do it quietly. If there is that kind of interest, reach out to a labor union that might be able to encourage you with an organizer, okay? Something like that. The main thing is to save democracy, capital DEMOCRACY, to save democracy, we must literally reignite, and it's percolating all across the country, in Amazon, in Starbucks, in vast areas, teacher strikes of the last few years and so on. The way to save democracy is to create an organized working class. It was whatever the faults and failings of labor, it is the working class that literally struggled for the making of democracy. The working class in all its diversity and all its laboring forms. Okay, whether they were agrarian populists out here in the Midwest, or industrial workers in Chicago, New York, and other cities, or for that matter, whether they were sharecroppers in the South, or before that, slaves, obviously, but sharecroppers in the South. Wherever you look, those who were struggling for more democratic polity, economy, and society were working people. But the way in which you can advance the cause is not merely by way of voting, which is essential, but equally, we must organize. Labor unions are the vehicle to saving democracy. It used to be said that unions were the schools of democracy. Okay, we all go to school, we learn civics or whatever, well, at least we used to. The point is that labor unions are, in essence, their own schools of democracy. They engage people, they debate about policy and program, and so on and so forth. If you're not in that kind of position to actually be in a union, then join an organization that's closely aligned with the labor movement. Look, there's Progressive Democrats of America, PDA. There's Our Revolution. There's DSA, okay, Democratic Socialists of America. Involve yourself in these kinds of organizations. There's even a chapter of DSA here in Green Bay now. I mean, things are percolating. The problem is that things have been, for 45 years, percolating on the left, and they are literally about to overwhelm democracy.
But do you think, I mean, my ideal fantasy would be, I mean, look at India, 1 million Indian farmers protesting for a year. Or I mean, look at anywhere in the UK, and these people get out in the streets by hundreds of thousands, and they demand.
Yeah, but be careful what you wish for. In the UK, it also they too, not long ago, had a very strong racist British nationalist movement.
Mhm.
Okay, and right now the Tories are still in power over there.
Yeah.
And the neoliberalism is rampant in Britain. Okay, in many ways, I'm just thinking. People used to ask me as well, should we pursue an indoors politics or an outdoors politics? Meaning, do we do a politics of government or do we have politics in the street? You cannot win ultimately until you legislate it. But you can't depend on the legislators if you're not prepared to push them, not merely individually, but collectively. Okay.
I think that's the issue we have, is that we're not doing things collectively. How do you suppose we would get to that point where we have true solidarity? And especially working class.
I mean, seriously speaking, there are struggles underway right now. I mean, look, it may well be small shops all across the country, but this is a real movement in Starbucks and other coffee shops, small, local and regional and national, in chains. Amazon may, it may be stalled, but it's going on. It's continuing. Even in the biggest of industries, the airline industry, the Airline Flight Attendants Union, headed by my dear friend Sarah Nelson, is organizing to finally, create a union and get recognition in Delta. Okay, this, probably the biggest I think it's the biggest airline around these days. Just today, I have it downstairs. Just today, I have an AFA button to show my solidarity, because out of Green Bay, you fly.
Oh, I saw it on Twitter. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So then I got the new one today that I'll wear my next time flying, which is big button Delta AFA kind of thing. I mean, it's happening. I happen to be, I've been a member of 2 labor unions over time. Right now, I'm a retiree, as they call it, of the American Federation of Teachers. For many years, I also belonged to the National Writers Union. That I no longer do because I'm not writing in quite the same way as I used to, and I do belong to the AFT and have paid my dues. Paid my dues there. Before that, before I had the AFT, I was in the National Education Association, not as aggressive as a union as the AFT folks, but they've come a long way. So you've got to be talking. First, you create solidarity with your fellow workers that you're close to. Then you look to the degree of, can we organize? Can we make this more than I've got your back, which, by the way, is the most fundamental thing of solidarity. I mean, I can't organize. I've never organized. I've been parts of organizing efforts. I've never been a labor organizer. That's up to groups to contact unions and secure organizers. I mean, I remember talking to Chris Smalls. The other thing about this, that I did Chris Smalls' podcast. Chris Smalls is being the champion of the Amazon workers and the Amazon labor union. And I remember saying to him, whatever you do, as you get this thing moving, try to get people to be thinking historically. Now, here's the other thing I want to make clear. Why was Bernie my candidate? Here's what I'll tell you. I liked Bernie ever since the 80s when he was running for mayor of Burlington. I used to say, oh, God, I wish I could get to vote for a guy like that. And then what the hell? I did get to vote for him in the primaries in Wisconsin both times, okay? Having said that, what really made Bernie the kind of candidate all candidates should be is he didn't just say, I'm going to fight for you. Bernie encouraged the fight in us.
Yeah.
See, I remember in 2015-16 when Hillary Clinton and Bernie were basically running against each other for the nomination. Hillary kept saying, I want to fight for you. I want to be your champion. And as soon as somebody says, I want to be your champion, you might as well say, okay, if I have to vote for you, I will, in that defensive like way. But I have a feeling that I'm going to have to push you. I'm going to have to organize and push you to do the right thing, because you're not going to do the right thing if you're not pushed. Look, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, he actually invited working people to push him. If anyone reads the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, which is not the fight, what made FDR and the Greatest Generation truly great, is that there was a real dialectic between that president and those people, that generation. He encouraged them. They ended up pushing him even further than he would otherwise have gone. So it was a real dialectic. We don't have any dialectic in politics right now. Okay. Everything's like, well, I guess I got to vote for these people, which is true right now. It's true. Okay. Not voting is not a political act. Okay. That's like punishing yourself and everyone, because they're going to have to suffer. Okay. More of the same shit. By the way, this is not an ad for Democrats. We've got to elect them, and then we've got to literally, at the day after the election, whether we win or lose, we've got to start pushing to demand to take over the Democratic Party in some way. That, by the way, I want to remind people, there are organizations out there, Progressive Democrats of America, Our Revolution, DSA, as primary examples. Also, if you think everyone thinks they're so cool, right? Well, I'll tell you what, get some of your friends together and go turn out for a county Democratic Party meeting. It is not inconceivable that at election of the board of that party, you guys could take it over. The Democratic Party is so lethargic that if you brought progressives into these meetings, you could take over the party. We did that here in Brown County in Wisconsin. Now, we didn't change the state party, but I will tell you, the assemblywoman in my district, who's just finishing her first term and running to be reelected, she heard me complain for 20 years about the folks in the Democratic Party failing to take up the question of pursuing an economic Bill of Rights for all Wisconsinites. And so she told me, I'm going to run and I'm going to do it. And she and another woman, new Democratic assemblywoman, they introduced to the party the idea of a Wisconsin Economic Justice Bill of Rights. And right now, the fight in Wisconsin Democratic Party in the very near future, because it started already, is going to be to push that party to the Democratic left. That's the only way it's going to happen. It's not going to happen any other way.
But they already have our votes. So why would they listen?
Well, wait. Why would they listen? Because they can be removed. They can be taken down. Look, they not only have your votes, they not only have your, they do have your votes. Okay. And look, the election is Tuesday. I'm not going to, anybody doesn't vote, as far as I'm concerned, you're on my shit list. Let me make that clear. Okay. But if you think voting is the answer to the problems, then you're not hearing me. Okay. And I will not accept cynical arguments. History shows me, as Thomas Paine said it. It's going to seem way out there, but Thomas Paine said it in Common Sense. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Now, that is both the truest and the falsest. If there's that's a true and false statement. It's true because, in fact, society, politics, the economy, all these things that go into our universe of life, they're humanly created. They're not divinely created. So therefore, they can be recreated. Okay, first, it's also not true because, of course, we're starting, in a situation that we did not necessarily ourselves create. We're confronting a world that already exists. But the point is that struggle matters. If struggle didn't matter, we would still have slavery. Women would still be without the vote. There would be no Social Security. There would be no labor unions. I mean, look around. Think about it historically. Okay. I don't think our situation is any more dire than it has been at other moments in American history in the past. But here's the key thing. This is why I think history is so important. When Americans have faced mortal crises in the 1770s, in the 1860s, and in the 1930s and 40s, they didn't just fight to defend whatever America might become. They literally radically transformed America. Not as much as they should have, not as much as we would love to have looked back to find out they had. The point is they did. They created the makings of a democratic republic. I know they allowed for the persistence of slavery and the marginalization of women. I know that. But they created the makings of a democratic republic, and they issued a statement saying all of us are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Civil War, okay, which was driven not only by North versus South in the classical fashion, but Southern slaves themselves in their tens of thousands raced to the Union lines after the Civil War had begun in order to enlist in the Union cause. And 250,000 African Americans served in the Union ranks during the Civil War and literally brought an end to slavery. And by way of the 13th and then the 14th and 15th Amendments, a radical transformation, which, not to say history works in a single line, but it was a radical transformation. Slavery was over. Okay. It was ended. Other forms of bondage may well have developed, but slavery was over. 1930s, the empowerment of labor, of workers and labor, and to create labor unions. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 that FDR signed into law placed the federal government behind the backs of workers to guarantee their right to organize and bargain collectively. In the 1960s, okay, Lyndon Johnson, by the way, who was more liberal than John Kennedy, he wanted to sign the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but he knew he couldn't do it without a push from behind and a push in Congress. And where did it come from? It came from the civil rights warriors in the streets. It came from labor unionists who lobbied on behalf of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Reform Act and in favor of Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, we are not at all stuck. We are not at the end of history, but we cannot leave our political battles to merely election day, as in the case of next November 8th. And if we lose, the fight's going to be all the tougher. So I'm telling you, people have got to vote.
So, what is something that you want people to, I mean, we've had a really in-depth, awesome discussion, but if somebody takes something away from this, what is the one thing you want to leave people? I know it's a deep question and I always stump people, but what do you primarily want them to take from this as far as historically, as far as FDR?
I want them to take this thought away. To be an American, as Thomas Paine argued, is to be radical. Okay? That don't let anyone tell you that Americans are anything other than radical. The point is, if they do that, then the trick is to prove them wrong. Just remember, what it means to be an American is to fight for the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you cannot have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you do not have the wherewithal to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must provide economic rights to all of us, to we the people. And that will take radical stances, radical action, an ever re-energized labor movement. Women turned out on that Trump inaugural weekend, I guess it was. Okay. They have to start turning out again. Yes, there must be massive demonstrations, but those demonstrations have to be directed at enhancing democracy. So
yes, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and again for Marianne for connecting us. What please leave state your website and your new book and anything you want to promote.
Okay, so for start, I don't have a website, but I am very let's hope I'm not driven off of Twitter. Okay, I know a lot of people have retreated from Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram. I have lots of friends and family who are. I am on Twitter. It's right there on the screen, at Harvey J. Kaye. I try to welcome every single person who follows me on Twitter. I do my damnedest to speak my mind on Twitter. I am verified. I hope I don't get charged for doing it. I'd hate to if he wants to impose a high fee for verification, then I don't know. I got to start figuring out some other venue. But for now, it's at Harvey J. Kaye, and let's make things happen. Jesus.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. To those watching, thank you so much for watching. We are, you may have heard of our organization, Harvey. We're a group of volunteers, March for Medicare for All. Last year, we organized 56 marches across the United States on July 24th.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
That's fabulous.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. So it was historical. Well, right now what we're doing is, and for those listening, we still need submissions. We are working with human rights lawyers, and we are compiling an official complaint for the Human Rights Council of the United Nations for leaving millions of people uninsured and without healthcare during a pandemic, no less. So we are putting it on record. Of course, we'd love your support. And with that, we are taking testimonials from people. So if you have any, stories of medical bills, medical bankruptcy, not being able to afford prescriptions, anything like that, please go to M4M for All and submit a testimonial so we can attach it with our complaint.
That's great to hear. I've given talks to DSA chapters on FDR to encourage. When he first proposed Social Security, he wanted universal health care included. That is, in 1935, he wanted it to be Social Security, including national health care. Republicans blocked him. The medical profession blocked him by way of the American Medical Association. And Southern Democrats forever tried to block such things. Why? because those white supremacist Southern Democrats did not want to integrate their hospitals, which they knew they would have to do if there was national health care. Okay. So, yeah, more power to anyone who fights for Medicare for all, or what I call universal health care. You know, it's just astounding to me that this Democratic Party has the audacity to call themselves Democratic with a capital D. But I want to repeat, I had learned a long time ago that until the movement gains the power and the force to bring about the changes we need, we vote at the least offensively. And sometimes you get lucky and you get to vote for the progressive you want, as I do here in Northeast Wisconsin for my assemblywoman, Christina Shelton.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to look them up. I'm not familiar with them.
Okay.
But
Christina Shelton, just type in, first you start, Wisconsin Economic Justice Bill of Rights. Google it and you'll see that.
Awesome.
Okay? But I want to give people hope. The Democratic, Alan Minsky and I, he's in PDA. He's the executive director of Progressive Democrats. He and I authored a new 21st century economic Bill of Rights idea. There were 3 articles we wrote about it. I did a Gravel video. If anyone's interested, you know, the Gravel videos, I did mine on the economic Bill of Rights. Please go look at it's called the most radical speech. What is it? The most radical speech ever by a president, something like that, which is all about the 20th century economic Bill of Rights. But what I say is we authored this argument. So look, here in Wisconsin, there are Democrats in the assembly ready to push it when the opportunity arises. The Massachusetts Democratic Party endorsed our economic Bill of Rights in their recent convention this summer. There are progressives who are on the verge of taking over the West Virginia Democratic Party. Okay. And they are eager to advance an economic Bill of Rights. So these things are happening. See what you can do. Oh, in New Hampshire, there's a legislator there who is seeking to organize a caucus inside the legislature to push an economic Bill of Rights. So it's happening. So, you know, let's just hope we don't lose our democracy before we can make these things actually happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You are incredible, and I've enjoyed our conversation so much.
Okay,
Please
let's do it again
care.
sometime then, okay?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so
Okay.
much, and thanks for watching, everyone.